guys, it's Doc Janelle. Welcome back to my channel. The course at hand is FAPC or Functional Anatomy and Physiology of the Cardiopulmonary and Integumentary System. For today's discussion, we'll be talking about the integumentary system. And if you're ready, let us start. So when we say integument, it literally translates as a tough outer protective layer or covering, which perfectly describes what the integumentary system does for the body. That's why this is how we call this entire system. More commonly, when we say integumentary system, people would think only of the skin. But actually, more than the skin, there are also other accessory structures included in this system, such as the hair, the nails, the glands, and sometimes we also include the blood vessels, the muscles, and the nerves from that area. It's important to understand that the integumentary system originates from the ectoderm together with the nervous system. But there is an exception. The dermis, which is a part of the skin, actually does not come from the ectoderm. Instead, it develops from the mesoderm. All right? So the skin, also known as the cutaneous membrane, covers the entire body. And when you lay it out, no, kapag nilatag yung buong skin natin, it is considered the largest organ in terms of surface area and weight. In terms of area, the skin measures about 2 square meters or 22 square feet. Wow. And it weighs 4.5 to 5 kilograms, composing about 16% of our body weight. So almost 1/5 of our body weight can already be attributed to the skin, no? So our skin has an average range of 0.5 to 4 millimeters in thickness. It is thinnest on the eyelids. In fact, pag hinawakan mo ang eyelids mo, no, you can definitely feel your fingers rubbing upon each other already. And it is thickest on the heels of our feet. The average thickness of our skin for the rest of the body is around 1 to 2 millimeters. So here is an image of our favorite K-pop idols with definitely peg natin in terms of skin quality. Yeah. So our skin has two major layers, the epidermis and the dermis. According to some other books, may third layer daw, no? And that third layer is the subcutaneous layer, also known as the hypodermis. So let's talk about them briefly. The epidermis is also considered as the outer but thinner layer. In this image, ito po yung ating epidermis. From the top until we get to the ridges here at this part. While the dermis is the inner but thicker layer. It starts at the ridges up until before the yellow part. And then, yung sabi nilang controversially third layer daw, pero later on we'll give a verdict kung layer ba talaga siya ng skin or not, is called the subcutaneous layer, also known as your hypodermis. And the function of the hypodermis is to attach the skin, both the epidermis and the dermis, to the underlying tissues like the muscles, the bones, and the other organs that we have. So, there are many different cells found in the epidermis. Let's talk about it muna, no? The epidermis. First, you have to remember that the epidermis is composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. That's a very important description that we have to remember. It's composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. When we say keratinized, it contains a protein called keratin. Okay, so the epidermis has keratin. It is stratified, meaning there are several layers. Squamous, meaning the cells appear flat. Okay, so later on when we look at the images, we'll be able to appreciate those descriptions. Now, the epidermis, aside from being composed of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, are actually composed of 4 major cell types. And these are your keratinocytes, here, your melanocytes, your Langerhans cells, and your Merkel cells. So we'll give a description for each major type of cell. All right. So the keratinocytes form 90% of the cells, meaning majority of the cells in the epidermis are actually composed of your keratinocytes. Sila yung pinakamarami. And the keratinocytes, as being expressed by the name, no, as the name implies, they produce keratin. And what's the purpose of this keratin? It is a tough fibrous protein that provides protection to our skin. It's a fibrous protein that adds protection to our skin. Okay? Next, we have your melanocytes here. And your melanocytes produce a pigment called melanin. No, you can see naman, this being pointed out in this image, yung mga melanin granules found inside the melanocytes. And melanocytes produce melanin, and melanin gives color to the skin. Okay? So, the purpose of melanocytes is that it produces protection against the damage from the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. So, yun pala yung purpose ng ating skin color, no? The darker you are, the lesser damage by ultraviolet radiation. Next, we have your Langerhans cells, which are, in fact, they are macrophages. So, they come from the red bone marrow. Okay? They are macrophages which go to the skin and helps the skin fight off infections if in case a bacteria or a virus may probably enter. So they are involved in immune response. And lastly, we have your Merkel cells, which are, may katabi sila na what we call tactile discs. No? Kita nyo ba in this image, no? We have your Merkel cell, and then attached to it is a tactile disc. One of their functions actually is to produce sensation of touch or to detect the sensation of touch. If you remember from our FAPN discussion, we said that the skin has several detectors, no, or receptors. It can detect touch, heat, pain, and vibration. And one of those receptors is Merkel cells. And what they can detect is touch. Okay? And if you will notice, the Merkel cell and the tactile disc are actually attached to a sensory neuron. As you can see in this image, it's attached to a sensory neuron. So here is an image now showing the different layers of the epidermis. So first, let's identify the 4 cell types. No? Right here, we have the Merkel cell. Merkel cell, it is adjacent to a tactile disc, and the tactile disc is continuous with a sensory neuron. Kaya, anything that we feel in the skin will be detected by your Merkel cells, and then tactile disc and sensory neuron. We also have your melanocytes, which produces your melanin and protects us from the UV damages of the sun. We also have here your Langerhans cells, no? Which are immune cells from the red bone marrow, which fight and eat your bacteria and viruses once they enter the skin. And the rest of these cells are your keratinocytes. And these ones on top contain your keratin, which is or provides the protective protection for the skin. There you go. Now, the epidermis may or may have 4 or 5 layers. Okay? Depende sa location or type of skin. When you talk about thin skin, which is majority of the skin that we have, no? Thin skin is majority of the skin. There are only 4 layers. Okay? But when we talk about thick skin, usually nasan ba yung thick skin natin? In our palms, in our fingers, and in our feet. In those areas with thick skin, we have 5 major layers. And what are these 5 major layers? We have your stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. So in order for us to identify, I showed here an image, stratum basale is the bottommost layer, followed by your stratum spinosum, your stratum granulosum, your stratum lucidum, and your stratum corneum. So para ma-memorize natin sila from top to bottom, I have a mnemonic. Come, let's get some beer. C for corneum, L for lucidum, G for granulosum, S for spinosum, and B for basale, from top to bottom. Now, why did I put an asterisk on stratum lucidum? No, I purposely did that in order to signify that stratum lucidum is the layer missing in thin skin. Okay? It is the layer that is missing in thin skin. So in thin skin, we only have basale, spinosum, granulosum, and corneum. Walang lucidum. Alright? I hope that's clear. Now let's talk about each layer individually. Starting with the bottommost layer, which is stratum basale. Stratum basale, which is being pointed out right now in your screens, is the bottommost layer and is composed of a single sheet of columnar cells. Kita nyo naman, no? Those columnar cells are taller compared to wideness. They are taller than wide, and it only has a single uniform layer of similarly appearing cells. No? It is then followed, if it is single layered, it is then followed by a multi-layered stratum called stratum spinosum, 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes. So basically, simply, it is the thickest layer. All right? And if you will also notice, iba na yung appearance of the cells in stratum spinosum compared to your stratum basale. Sa basale, you have your columnar cells. They are taller than wide. But in stratum spinosum, kaya sa tinawag na spinosum, kasi yung cells, they appear spine-like. Para daw may mga spines o parang may mga galamay. No? Bakit nagkakaroon ng galamay? It's because there is an overpopulation of cells in those area. And why is that? Because stratum basale and stratum spinosum are mitotically active, meaning they continually divide in order to produce more and more cells. And because of the overpopulation, dikit-dikit na yung mga cells, halos wala ng spaces in between, kaya minsan naiipit yung ibang parts nila ng ibang cells, producing extensions. So, let's take a look at this Langerhans cells as an example. Naipit tong part na to ng dalawang cells. So, nagkaroon siya ng patulis na pag ganoon. Can you see that? Even here, naipit siya ng dalawang cell, karoon ng patulis. Here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So, that does not only happen with the Langerhans cells, but even for these keratinocytes. Kaya tinawag sila na stratum spinosum. Now, as mentioned, basale and spinosum are both mitotically active. So actually, they can be grouped together and they are called, pag pinagsama na sila, they are called stratum germinativum. This is the collective name of stratum basale and stratum spinosum because this is where continuous cell division occurs and it produces all the other epidermal layers. All right? Next, we have stratum granulosum. This is this layer here in the middle. Now, it's called stratum granulosum because this is where protein granules are formed, giving it a granular appearance. Kita nyo naman din, no? Iba na ulit yung shape ng cell. It's starting to become more flat, but it's very obvious that they contain these purplish-looking granules inside of them. And these granules are made up of protein, specifically keratohyalin and lamellar granules. So eventually, the keratohyalin and lamellar granules will become your keratin. And keratin is very important because it helps the skin become water repellent. No? Notice na kapag naliligo tayo, no, hindi tumataba yung katawan natin after maligo. Because the skin does not absorb the water, instead it repels the water. That's because of the keratin that we have. Also important to know about your stratum granulosum. This is the layer where the cells start to die. Yes, namamatay po ang mga cells natin in the skin. That's why we have or what we call dead skin cells. Basically, the cells on the topmost layer, specifically your corneum and lucidum, are actually dead cells. And where or in which layer did they start to die? In granulosum. Notice, wala na silang nucleus pagdating sa granulosum as compared dito sa spinosum and basale, right? So this is where they start to die. All right. Next is the stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum is special because again, it's only found in thick skin, specifically in our fingertips, in our palms, and in our soles. Lucidum, when translated, means light. That's why if you notice, it has no color. No, it appears very light, very ghostly. Yan. And later on, when you see the specimen, you will appreciate. Talagang parang nagkaroon ng walang kulay doon sa layer ng skin natin. And lastly, we have your stratum corneum, which is again composed of many sublayers of flat, look at the description, dead keratinocytes. And these dead keratinocytes can also be called corneocytes or squames. Kaya nga tinawag natin siya na keratinized stratified squamous kasi it's made up of squames. Okay? So, important for us to know that stratum corneum is continuously shed. Natatanggal po yan. And they are replaced by the cells which are produced by your spinosum and basale, collectively known as stratum germinativum. So, as these layers produce more and more cells, umaangat ng umaangat yung mga cells na yun hanggang matanggal nila yung top layer. Alright? So, if the topmost layer or stratum corneum will constantly be exposed to friction, then they can stimulate the formation of your callus or callo. Remember when you still had face-to-face classes, no? And you would write na magsusulat ka. After writing, you would notice parang may bump ka na on your fingers, especially on the parts na come in contact with your ball pen. No? So, nagkakaroon tayo ng kalyo because there is constant friction in those areas. So, here is what the epidermis actually looks like, no? Especially that keratin layer. So, yung keratinization is the accumulation of keratin. Saan galing ang keratin natin? Keratohyalin and lamellar granules. At nagsastart yan sa granulosum at completely makukover nila yung cells pagdating ng stratum corneum. Ayan po sila. They cover each cell perfectly. Ayan. And if there is excess production of your stratum corneum, and if they are found in the scalp, we call that dandruff. An excess of keratinized cells shed from the scalp. Not only will you be able to find them in the scalp, but also in our eyebrows, on the sides of your nose, in areas where hair also grows. So putting everything together, this is the diagram of the epidermis. You have your single layer of columnar cells with a mitotic activity. We call it stratum basale. Followed by the thickest layer with overpopulation of cells. No, dikit-dikit. Kita nyo naman, very overpopulated. Now we have your stratum spinosum. Next, we have together, spinosum and basale is called stratum germinativum. Next, we have your stratum granulosum, which appears darker and has keratohyalin and lamellar granules. And these are your protein granules, right? Followed by the light layer of lucidum, only found in thick skin. And then the dead layer of keratinocytes called corneocytes or squames in stratum corneum. And now we have an actual specimen in this part. So here, we have the actual specimen here, no? Again, a single layer of your stratum basale, followed by your thick layer of stratum spinosum. And look, biglang nagdarken sa part na to, di ba? That's your stratum granulosum. And then after that dark part, biglang pumuti. Biglang namuti doon sa part na yun. That's your stratum lucidum. And then flat layer of dead cells, that's your stratum corneum. Okay? So now we're able to appreciate the layers. Next, we have dermis. If the epidermis is made up of your non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, the dermis naman is composed of connective tissue. Please do remember that, yung difference ng epidermis and dermis. Si epidermis, non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, while si dermis, connective tissue containing collagen and elastic fibers. If si epidermis has 4 or 5 layers, si dermis only has 2 layers. And these are the outer papillary layer and the deeper reticular layer. Pero, even if the dermis only has 2 layers, it is much thicker compared to your epidermis. Just take a look at this diagram, no? This is the entire epidermis. Yan na siya lahat, all 5 layers. While your dermis, look, ang kapal-kapal niya. Alright? And it is in the dermis that you will find your nerves, you will find your vessels, such as your arteries and your veins. Okay? So let's talk about these 2 layers. First, with the outer papillary region. So sabi natin, the dermis is made up of connective tissue. The outer papillary region, colored purple in this image, is composed of areolar connective tissue. Yun yung specific connective tissue niya, areolar connective tissue. It has a lot of collagen and elastic fibers, and it contains our touch and free nerve endings. Kanina si epidermis, meron din siyang sensory receptor, di ba? Anong cell yon? Merkel cell. At anong katabi? Tactile disc. At diretso na sa sensory neuron. Right? So, sa outer papillary region, meron ulit tayong mga sensory receptors, specifically for touch and for pain. Those are your touch and free nerve endings. Okay? And another important thing about the outer papillary region is the formation of these grooves, no, yung up and down, yung parang mga humps. And we call that dermal papillae. Okay? The dermal papillae. Important yung dermal papillae natin because yan ang nagdidictate ng fingerprints natin. So, because of this movements of up and down in the dermal papillae, it will produce an effect on the epidermis, thereby producing yung up and down also that we see in our fingerprints. No? Very good. So now we'll talk about the deeper reticular region. If the outer papillary region is composed of areolar connective tissue. The deeper reticular region naman is composed of dense irregular connective tissue. So, tandaan din yung difference ng dalawa, ha? Dense irregular yung reticular region, areolar yung papillary region. Again, it has your collagen and elastic fibers, and we find the adipose cells, hair follicles, nerves, oil glands, and sweat glands deeper into the dermis, specifically in the reticular region. Also, it is in the reticular region that we develop the stretch marks, no? Especially, nag-a-appear yung mga yan if the skin is stretched too much. Alright? So, other important information about the dermis is that they have what we call lines of cleavage. So, ito mga lines of cleavage, also known as tension lines, are the predominant direction of the underlying collagen fibers. Meaning, yung mga collagen na nasa loob ng dermis natin, meron silang sinusundan na direksyon. Generally, ganito yung itsura nila, no? Yan. So, anong importance ng lines of cleavage or tension lines? If you develop a wound, nagkasugat ka or inoperahan ka, and the direction of the wound or surgery is opposite the lines of cleavage, then a scar is expected to develop. So, kunyari, nahiwa ang likod mo, pababa, like here. Hindi siya sumusunod dun sa lines of cleavage. So, definitely, you will see a scar after that wound. Pero, kunyari, inoperahan ka sa tiyan, let's say, cesarean section, at pag ganito ang hiwa, So, hindi masyadong obvious kasi it follows the lines of cleavage, no? Even for patients who undergo breast augmentation, bakit under the breast yung hiwa? Kasi it follows the lines of cleavage. So, hindi obvious ang scar formation. Okay? Also, we have your epidermal ridges. These are the contours of our skin produced by your dermal papillae. No? At yan ang reason kung bakit meron tayong finger or footprints. So here we can see no, yung humps produced by the dermal papillae. Sorry, let me just remove myself from the image. There you go. So you have the humps produced by the dermal papillae, up, down, up, and because of those humps, nagkaroon ng effect yun on the epidermis, no? Up, down, up. So because of that, magiging obvious yun sa ating epidermis. We call it epidermal ridges. And mapoproduce ang ating fingerprints. So bakit ba mahalaga yung fingerprints? Bakit mahalaga yung footprints? Because they increase the firmness of our grip and increases friction even in your palms, 'di ba? Mapapansin mo yan, may epidermal ridges ka para mas kumapit when you hold something. So the study of the patterns of epidermal ridges is what we call dermatoglyphics. Next, we have the hypodermis, also known as the subcutaneous layer. Again, according to some books, they argue that this is the third layer of the skin, but for the sake of our discussion, let's give it a verdict. It is not part of the skin, although it attaches the skin to the underlying tissues and organs. Yun lang yung function talaga niya. And this is represented by this yellow layer at the bottom made up of subcutaneous fat. Kaya tinawag na subcutaneous layer. Alright? Now, one important thing about the hypodermis is it contains your Pacinian corpuscles. Please look at the spelling, ha? Pacinian corpuscles. Ito siya, para siyang paikot. Ayan. At anong function niyan? It detects external pressure. So again, we have a sensory receptor. So ilan na inaaral natin na sensory receptors? Tatlo na, di ba? Meron sa epidermis, your Merkel cells. Meron tayo sa dermal papillary region. Meron tayong sensory and free nerve endings. At meron din tayo sa hypodermis, your Pacinian corpuscles. So now let's talk about the structural basis of skin color. So the variations in skin color come from the amount of three different pigments that are present in the skin. And these are melanin, carotene, and hemoglobin. Of course, we've already mentioned melanin kanina, no? This is produced by your melanocytes, and the skin pigment will range from a yellow, red, brown, or black pigment. Depende sa amount ng melanin present. So the amount of melanin causes the skin's color to vary nga from different shades. Important to remember that the number of melanocytes are the same in all people, whether you are from the US, whether you are from Africa, or from Asia, such as the Philippines. Pare-pareho lang tayo ng bilang ng melanocytes. Pero bakit may differences in skin color? Nagkakatalo tayo in the amount of melanin produced by our melanocytes. So generally, people in the Western world, in the US, in Europe, pareho lang yung number of melanocytes natin pero hindi ganoon ka-active yung melanocytes nila in producing melanin. People living in Africa, very active ang kanilang melanocytes. And people living in Asia, such as in the Philippines, I think moderate amount of activity. Kaya people tend to be fair to medyo brownish yung skin natin, no? So, a nevus or a mole is a benign overgrowth of melanocytes. So if you will look at a mole right now in your skin, it's because medyo maraming melanocyte in that area producing marami ding mga melanin. Therefore, pag nakita na natin siya sa skin, merong black dot. So it's because of an overgrowth of melanocytes producing a big amount of melanin. Now, we also have people who do not have melanin. And these are what we call albinos, no? This is represented by this image right here. So, this is an inheritable disease na mamana po ito. And they still have melanocytes, but their melanocytes cannot produce any amount of melanin. Ang mga Westerners, meron silang melanin, no? Pero hindi siguro ganun karami. But for albinism, wala. They have absent melanin. So therefore, their skin, even their hair, white lang talaga sila. And even sometimes the color of their eyes, no, affected then by the absence of melanin. Now, the second condition that we have in this image is vitiligo. This is a condition in which there is partial or complete loss of melanocytes. So, if in albinism, there are still melanocytes, but they cannot produce melanin, in vitiligo, ang nawawala, the melanocytes themselves. The only problem with vitiligo is iba't ibang areas yung nawawala ng melanocytes, thereby producing this irregular pattern of discoloration. And this is exactly what Michael Jackson had, no? He developed vitiligo, and eventually what he did, he completely bleached his skin para magpantay yung parts na brown at yung parts na white. Now, we also have other pigments, just carotene and hemoglobin, di ba? Sabi natin carotene is actually familiar, right? You have probably heard of beta carotene found in carrots, found in other food, di ba? Especially from fruits and vegetables. So this is a yellow-orange pigment which when we eat too much food containing beta-carotene, it will produce a discoloration in our skin. So try nyo, 1 week kain lang kayo ng carrots. Eventually, you will notice your palms, even sometimes the skin under your tongue, magsa-start na siyang mag-yellowish or orangish. Yan. And lastly is your hemoglobin. This is a pigment producing red color. And usually, napapansin natin yung hemoglobin if malakas yung blood flow in a certain area of the body. Like, kunwari, mainit ang panahon, you will notice your palms, you will notice your cheeks, no, na namumula. It's because mabilis or malakas yung blood flow in those areas. Alright? Now, let's go to the accessory structures of the skin. And we'll start that with the hair. So, ang hair natin is composed of dead keratinized epidermal cells. Very similar doon sa ating epidermis, di ba? Dead keratinized cells din sila. So, basically, hair and ang ating epidermis, halos pareho po sila ng content. Ang function ng hair is for protection, reduction of heat loss, and for sensing mga light touch, di ba? Kahit medyo mababaw yung pagkakahawak sa'yo, you would immediately feel, no, na may somebody's touching you. So, even light touch, nasa sense ng ating hair. Now, let me introduce to you the different parts of the hair. First, let's talk about the hair shaft. Ito po yan, no? This part. It is the part of the hair that projects above the surface of the skin. So, pag lumabas ng skin, taawag na natin dun sa hair na yon, hair shaft. Hair root naman ang tawag natin pag yung part ng hair is underneath the skin. Okay? Underneath the skin, we call it hair root. Now, we also have the hair follicle, which is a sheath-like indentation or depression of the epidermis into dermis. So, explain natin. We said earlier that hair is composed of similar materials such as the epidermis. So, nanggaling sa epidermis ang hair. And, nagkaroon ng indentation or depression or bumaba po. Yan. So, from the epidermis, bumaba yung ating cells na nagpo-produce ng epidermis. Bumaba siya hanggang dermis and then umakyat ulit. Forming parang lalagyanan, parang socks nandoon sa loob ng ating dermis. And from that, we call it hair follicle at doon po napoproduce ang ating hair. Alright? Other important structures seen in this image are your arrector pili. Ito po yung arrector pili natin, no? It is a smooth muscle connected to one side of the hair follicle and attached to the dermal papillae, no? Yan. So once mag-contract ang arrector pili natin, it will produce your goosebumps, no? Yung sinasabi nating tumitindig yung balahibo. So, paano tumatayo yung ating balahibo? Dahil hinihila po sila ng arrector pili muscles natin. Alright? So, these are smooth muscles. You do not control them. It automatically happens. And last part of the hair is your sebaceous gland. Ito po siya. Yan. So the sebaceous gland produces a substance called sebum. In other words, yung sebum, they also call it oil. So, ang gland na ito, it produces oil and it releases that oil or sebum directly into the hair follicle. So, yung duct po niya is connected to the hair follicle. Now, why is sebum important? Bakit doon siya nakakonect sa hair follicle? Because it prevents moisture loss, it conditions both the hair and the skin, and it prevents bacterial growth. So imagine, no? May purpose pala yung oil na pinoproduce ng ating mga balat. It prevents bacterial growth. Now, there are different types of hair also present in the body, no? We have the lanugo, we have the vellus hairs, and we also have the terminal hair. So, when babies are born, you will probably notice that they have this parang thin layer of hair on the back of on their back and even in their arms. And we call that lanugo. Eventually, yung lanugo na yan, mawawala rin yan. It will fall off. Okay, so hindi lalaki si baby na hairy. Next, we have the vellus hairs. The vellus hairs naman are the thin, whitish appearing hair found usually in the face, no? So usually for babies also, and even for women, since wala namang facial hair ang women, probably notice yung vellus hairs na yan. And lastly, we have terminal hairs. Of course, for males, once you start to shave your facial hair, no, you will notice yung papalit na buhok doon sa shinave mo, it's much thicker and quite stiff in appearance. And those are what we call terminal hair. So hair color, similar to skin color, is also determined by the amount and type of melanin. So basically, kapag blonde ka, medyo may konting melanin. Kasi ang melanin naman, it also produces your yellow pigment. Kapag naman red hair ka, baka carotene naman yung meron ka. No? Or kapag black hair, medyo maraming melanin doon. Alright? So another another accessory skin structure that we have are our sudoriferous or sweat glands. And there are two types of sweat glands in the body. The first is the eccrine sweat glands. Ito yan, yung yellow structure na to. And we also have your apocrine sweat glands. So let's look at the difference between these two types of sweat glands, no? Ang ating eccrine sweat glands, they produce substances, specifically sweat, na directly nilalabas papunta ng skin. Kita nyo naman, no? Yung duct niya, paakyat, papunta diretso sa skin. And yung sweat na pinoproduce ng eccrine sweat glands natin, it helps to cool the body by evaporation. Alright? So maglalabas siya ng pawis, and then yung pawis na yan, it will coat the skin para eventually mag-evaporate at lumamig ang katawan natin. Kaya naman pag mainit ang panahon, no, anong tendency ng body? Mag-produce ng maraming pawis. So kaya tayo pinagpapawisan because the body is trying to cool the body by producing these sweats, no? And itong mga sweat produced by eccrine also eliminates small amount of wastes. So next we have the apocrine sweat glands, no? Ito naman mga apocrine sweat glands natin. Usually located yan sa axilla or kilikili, sa groin or sa singit, in our areola or in the bearded regions of adult males. Notice the difference between their ducts. Si eccrine diretso sa balat, while si apocrine papunta po ng hair follicle. So medyo pareho sila nitong structure nito. Ano ba to? This is your sebaceous gland, which produces your sebum or oil, and also doon nila dinediretso sa hair follicle nila. No? So usually itong sweat produced by apocrine glands are secreted during emotional stress and sexual excitement. In fact, it is the apocrine glands that produces yung sweat natin na may amoy. Yan, no? So, tinatawag yun na pheromones. Alright? So, usually, ang acne also starts in the hair follicle. At bakit nagkakaroon ng acne? It's because of the build-up of oil and sweat in our hair follicle. Once maipon doon ng oil and sweat at hindi po makalabas ng hair follicle, magsa-start na yan, maipon, at magkakaroon na tayo ng pimple. Okay? Next, we have your ceruminous glands. So, these are glands naman found in our ear canal. So, they also produce a waxy substance called cerumen. So, skin pala ang nagpo-produce ng earwax natin, no? Yung mga ceruminous glands natin. And important actually yung ating cerumen. Why? Because they produce a sticky barrier that prevents entry of foreign bodies into the ear canal. And do not worry, or sabi, I probably you've seen on TikTok, they advise no na wag daw tanggalin yung ating earwax because it actually helps remove mga foreign bodies. And the body has a way naman or a system of removing cerumen. So kusa po nilalabas yan ng ating tenga. Next, we have the nails, and look at this. The nails are composed of hard, keratinized epidermal cells. So again, similar sa hair, similar sa ating epidermis, yung substance or yung cells found in the nails. And they are usually located on the dorsal side of our fingers and toes. Alright? So yung part na kinakat natin with the nail cutter is called free edge. While the part that you color when you go to your manicurista is called nail body or sometimes nail plate. The whitish part at the bottom is called lunula, while the skin bago yung lunula is what we call cuticle. Later, may other name pa yung cuticle na yan. And the nail under the skin is what we call nail root. So, looking at it on a side view, yan, this is how it looks like. So, orient ulit natin, no? Free edge, nail body, pag nasa taas, nail plate pag nasa ilalim. Okay? We have your lunula, your cuticle, also known as eponychium. Please remember, eponychium. And the part of the nail underneath the skin is called nail root. Now, paano humahaba ang nail natin? Saan nanggagaling? It comes from actually your nail matrix. So, sana matandaan natin yan. Nail matrix will grow the nail root. So, hahaba yung nail root natin hanggang lumabas na siya at maging nail body. At pag umabot siya sa dulo, magiging free edge na siya. Alright? So, we're nearing the end of the discussion. Now, we'll talk about types of skin. So, sabi natin, thin skin is what we see in all other parts of the body except in the palms, in the fingers, and on the foot. So, yung mga parts na yan naman sa palms, fingers, and foot, these are what we call thick or hairless skin. Now, let's go to the functions of the skin, no? These are the main functions of the skin. Isa-isahin natin yan. Protection, sensation, vitamin D production, and temperature regulation, at excretion. So, paano nakakatulong ang skin in protection? Una, the skin has keratin. And keratin prevents water absorption and water loss. As mentioned, when we take a bath, we don't become bloated after taking a bath, no? And why is that? Because keratin prevents water from being absorbed in the skin. At the same time, when we go under the sun, we do not become or we do not end up becoming thinner, di ba? Di tayo pumapayat pag pumunta tayo under the sun or kapag napawisan tayo. It's because the skin also prevents water loss. Moreover, the skin builds a barrier, kaya nga integument, outer covering barrier, in order to prevent the entry of microorganisms, no? At other protective capacity, it prevents or the skin prevents the body from abrasion, from trauma. Yung madikit ka lang sa isang bagay, hindi ka naman agad nasusugat, di ba? So, kailangan medyo may force bago masugat, di ba? So, it protects the body from injury, from UV rays, from dust, and other materials. Sensation, we also mentioned this, that in the skin, there are different sensory receptors, no? For heat, for pain, for touch, and even for vibration. At binanggit natin yan kanina, in the epidermis, you have your Merkel. In the papillary region, you have your free and your touch and free nerve endings. And in the hypodermis, we have your Pacinian corpuscles. Next is vitamin D production. So, alam nyo ba that in our skin, there is a precursor molecule for active vitamin D. Meaning, nasa skin na natin yung ingredient to produce vitamin D. At paano napoproduce ang vitamin D? Through sun exposure. So, pag nagpa-araw kayo, yung sun, i-activate niya yung precursor molecule in our skin para ma-convert po yung mga yan into active vitamin D. So, even if you do not take vitamin D, magpa-araw ka lang certain amount of time, daily, you will get your recommended amount of vitamin D. Next is temperature regulation, which is very important, no? So, let's say, mainit ang panahon. What will you notice, no? Una, pag mainit ang panahon, you will sweat, right? So, the sweat produced by your eccrine glands will cover the skin and will cool the body through evaporation. Moreover, when it is hot, what the body will do is to command the blood vessels to bring blood towards the outer part of the skin. So, pag mas maraming blood sa outer part of the skin, you will notice mamumula ka. Kaya naman pag mainit, namumula po ang ating skin sa ating face, mapula po ang ating lips, even ang ating ears mapula because there is more blood flow towards the outer part of the skin para malose ang ating heat through convection and radiation. The same is true kapag malamig ang panahon. Pag malamig ang panahon, what happens to the skin? It appears pale. No? Parang maputla tayo. Pag hinawakan mo ang balat, ang lamig-lamig. And why is that? Because the body commands the blood vessels to prevent the skin from going to the outer parts of the skin. So dahil walang dugo na pumupunta sa outer part, namumutla ang itsura. Malamig ang pakiramdam. So, bakit ginawa ng body yon? To keep the temperature inside regulated. Para makip niya yung heat inside. Alright? And lastly, for excretion. So, alam naman natin, through sweat, lumalabas ang ating mga toxins. So, just to point out thermoregulation, we will already mention this, that perspiration assists in cooling the body through evaporation. Kapag naman mainit ang panahon, nagkakaroon ng vasodilation. So, lumalaki yung mga blood vessels sa outer part ng skin to facilitate heat loss para doon pumunta yung dugo para mabawasan ng init through radiation and conduction. Pag malamig naman ang panahon, there is vasoconstriction. Nagsasara ang mga blood vessels in the skin to prevent heat loss through radiation and conduction. Alright? Now, I just want to show you the different types of wound healing, but more of this in our next video. So, this is an example of wound healing, specifically epidermal healing. So, pag epidermal healing, yung epidermis lang ang natanggal. From basale, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum lang po ang natanggal. So, ang mangyayari lang, magmumultiply lang ulit ang ating stratum basale, magiging stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, at corneum, para maisara yung nawalang parte ng ating skin. Pag naman deeper ang wound, let's say hanggang epidermis, then medyo mas complicated yung healing process, no? Nandyan na yung tinatawag na blood clot formation, fibroblast formation, and more of that when we talk about it next week. And also, pag-uusapan din dyan ang scar tissue, keloid, no? Yeah. So lastly, what happens to the skin when we age? Ayan. So of course, wrinkling happens kasi nababawasan ng collagen, nababawasan ng elastic fibers, nawawala rin po ang ating mga Langerhans cells, kaya nagbabawasan ng immune response ng skin. Mas prone tayo to infections, no? Notice sa mga matatanda na bedridden, very prone sila to bed sores, no? Moreover, the skin becomes dehydrated, mas nagka-crack na ang skin, there is decreased sweat production, namumuti rin ang balat actually, no, kapag tumatanda tayo because namamatay ang mga melanocytes natin. Notice our hair, di ba? Bakit pumuputi ang buhok? Because we lose our melanocytes in those areas. There is also loss of subcutaneous fat, kaya pansinin mo ang mga matatanda. Mas lubog na lubog yung kanilang mga cheeks. Mas parang kitang-kita yung contours ng kanilang bone kasi nawawala na yung fat ng balat natin. There is a general decrease in skin thickness, I mean. Tapos, mas nagiging susceptible tayo to pathological conditions. Also, the growth of hair and nails may also decrease, di ba? So, nagiging brittle yung ibang parts ng ating balat. Alright, so that's the end of our discussion. Hopefully, you were able to learn something. Till our next video. Shalom!